its entire existence, the Bulgarian state sat at the frontier between Christendom and Islam. For centuries, it was the first line of defense of the old continent against conquerors bursting forth from the Asian landmass. In the 8th century, Byzantium was attacked by Arab armies, a formidable force. Byzantium's capital city, Constantinople, was on the brink of succumbing to the invaders, and Europe as a whole was sure to follow. The Byzantines turned to Bulgaria for help. The Bulgarian ruler Tervel responded immediately, sent an expeditionary force that dealt a decisive blow to the Arabs, and stemmed the direction of Islamic conquest for another 6 centuries. The Danube forms the natural northern border of the Bulgarian state. Ancient Rome designated the mighty river as the frontier between the civilized south and the barbaric north. Some of Europe's most remarkable cities grew along its course. The fate of the continent was oftentimes decided there too, especially the fate of modern Europe of the 20th and 21st centuries. One very ancient Danubian city is Nikopol. Two of the most symbolic battles in European history were fought over Nikopol. The first marked the end of an era, the second, the beginning of one. After the first, which gave rise to the late medieval period, Christendom lost much of Europe. After the second, Christian powers pushed back the Ottoman Empire and regained control over the continent. It was an Eastern Reconquista, the beginning of modernity. It all began at the end of the 14th century. Europe was a patchwork of feudal principalities. The most powerful and influential Balkan state, Bulgaria, had practically disappeared. Its capital, Turnovo, had fallen to the Ottomans. Tsar Ivan Shishman, however, wasn't there. He was in Nikopol. According to the medieval rules of engagement, A state is not subdued as long as its ruler is alive and at large. Much like in chess, you may only possess a king against a queen and a rook, but the game isn't over until the king is down. The game may end in stalemate. And so Nikopol became the last Bulgarian capital. At the same time, the once mighty Byzantium had shrunk to the size of its capital city and a few inconsequential provinces. This process had for a century been mirrored by the rise of a Western Anatolian Turkish principality led by the Osmanoglu dynasty. It was out of this kernel that the Ottoman Empire grew and reached Europe. Its rise seemed unstoppable. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid the Thunderstruck captured the last Bulgarian Tsar, Ivan Shishman, in Nikopol and executed him. This was the end of the game for the Bulgarians. Checkmate. It finally dawned on many European rulers that they had committed strategic blunders endangering their own states. Pope Boniface IX called for a new crusade against the evil rising in the East. Noblemen the continent over gathered under the standards. The English and the French put a temporary halt on their 100-year-old conflict. Most surviving Eastern European rulers had become vassals of the Sultan, but had not resigned themselves to their fates yet, and looked towards the west with some hope. The coalition that came into being included the Holy Roman Empire, France, Hungary, Croatia, Wallachia, Venice, Genoa, England, the Order of the Knights of St. John, Scotland, Castile, Burgundy, and Bulgaria. The West Europeans left Dijon in April of 1396. The last Great Crusade was underway. It traveled via Strasbourg and Bavaria and reached the upper Danube, whence it boarded a flotilla of boats and descended on Buda. There it joined Hungarian King Sigismund's army. Sigismund would become the progenitor of many a European royalty, and was one of the best-traveled medieval rulers. He personally took part in many a local conflict. Nikopol was only the first of many targets for the Crusaders. They had colossal plans to take over Constantinople and via present-day Turkey and Syria proceed to Palestine. The main group went through Serbia. Some knights crossed into present-day Romania and forded the Danube. The Genoese and Venetians provided naval transport. The main force, numbering around 16,000, reached the walls of the city at the end of September. They expected a relatively easy victory, despite the fact that Nikopol is not hard to defend due to the favorable terrain. The fortress controls the lower reaches of the river, too. The defenders were well prepared and supplied. The knights decided to wait. They knew that Sultan Bayezid was away laying siege to Constantinople, and so chose to starve the defenders. The crusading army gave themselves to pleasure. However, Bayezid learned of their arrival, decided to abandon the Byzantine capital and dashed towards Nikopol. He must have understood that subduing the city of cities would be easier if he prevailed over this new threat. In the meantime, wine flowed and women danced beneath the Danubian fortress's walls. Fortune was about to desert the plumed heads of Europe's finest. The Sultan was approaching at the head of 15,000 troops. Sigismund found out about the Turks' advance and warned his co-religionists that the enemy was mere hours away, but the majority of knights were too drunk to take notice. Others thought that the Hungarian king was positioning himself for a power grab. The other leader of the crusade was Count Jean de Nevers, heir to the Duchy of Burgundy and cousin of the English and French kings. Aside from him, there were many other noblemen present: the Polish aristocrat Stibor of Stiboritz, the influential Hungarian Baron Nicholas II Garai, the Frenchman Count Philippe d'Artois, and Enguerrand VII de Coucy, an experienced commander and son-in-law of the English King Edward III. The Vlach Voivode, Mircea the Elder, and Stepan Laskovich, master of Croatia, were also in attendance. The Ottomans were led by Bayezid I, his Grand Vizier Chandarli Ali Pasha, Evernos Bey, the founder of the distinguished Ottoman martial family, as well as the Serbian ruler Stefan Lazarević. The fateful battle began at dawn on the 25th of September, 1396. Mounted on ironclad horses, impervious to enemy arrows in their armor, the knights looked unbeatable. They were like early versions of tanks, a horrifying sight to the contemporary eye. Facing them were the Ottoman Turks in light chainmail and turbans. However, the Crusaders' intelligence was terrible. They had no idea who they were up against. King Sigismund of Hungary had a more realistic take on things, but he knew that his allies would attack immediately. The king sent a messenger to the Westerners, imploring them to wait for 2 hours so that his spies could return to safety, bearing important information about the enemy. At an emergency meeting, the elder nobles agreed with the king, but Philippe d'Artois, the Count d'Eu, accused the monarch of wanting all the glory to himself. The rest he reproached for their cowardice and declared that he was to join the fray immediately. Following noble custom, he and Count de Nevers attacked the Turks at the head of their armies. For this, de Nevers won the monkier Jean the Fearless. The Turks fielded light cavalry up front, and behind it raised rows of sharpened stakes that kept their Janissary infantry protected. The knights easily scattered the lightly armed Turkish horsemen, but then fell onto the stakes, which killed and hurt their own mounts. The Turkish infantry targeted the unprotected parts of the animals' bodies. The knights were dismayed. Some of their leaders were killed. Dreading what he saw coming, Sigismund entered the fray to the defense of the Western Crusaders. He managed to bring into formation his huge army and lead it onto the battlefield. The attack was so sudden that the Sultan considered withdrawing. At this precise moment, his son-in-law and vassal, the Serbian ruler Stefan Lazarević, rammed Sigismund's flank. That action signaled the end of the Crusader army. Sigismund saw the futility of it all and slipped away from the battlefield. The Western Knights were either slaughtered or captured. Over the course of the next 24 hours, 3,000 captives were beheaded. A mere 300 were spared, the ones who could attract and were able to pay the greatest ransoms. The number of casualties amongst the captives speaks volumes of their conceit. They had embarked on a military adventure without securing ransom money for themselves, in contravention of the rules of engagement, and consequently lost their heads. Not too long after, Bayezid's own life would end in a dramatic manner. Having lost the Battle of Ankara, the mighty Sultan was subjected to a refined humiliation at the hands of his captor, Tamerlane. He lived out his days in a small cage which served as a footstool to the Mongol, while his favorite wife danced naked at the Khan's dinner table. The Battle of Nikopol marked the end of an era for humanity. Eastern Europe remained a part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The Nikopol Crusade was not a wholly religious campaign, as some of the previous crusades had been. Almost all powers of note on the continent took part in it. It is a symbol of Christian and European solidarity. Sigismund took on the title King of Bulgaria. The newly subdued country did not remain leaderless and continued its existence as a state and not a territory, albeit formally. Nikopol is a city in northern Bulgaria. It is a port on the Danube. Several kilometers from the city, a tributary, Osum, flows into the larger river. The spot is easily recognized by the old German-built bridge that spans the mouth of Osum. Across the Danube is the Romanian town Târgu Mugarele, founded by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. The Romanians evidently placed high value on the strategic location of this particular stretch of coastline, situated as it is between one of the most important cities of the Upper Moesia province, Pannonia, and the Black Sea. The name Nikopol is made up of two Greek words, Nike, victory, and polis, city. Nikopol is the city of victory indeed. Apart from memories of great battles, however, the Bulgarian side of the Danube harbors many personal stories, like the one about Thracian maiden Ilia and her Roman mentor Fronton. He saved her father from being beaten by drunken Roman soldiers, and she fell in love with him, only to be poisoned by Valeria, Fronton's Roman mistress. Heartbroken, he built a water fountain in her memory. The fountain and her epitaph are preserved in Nikopol. The ruins of the fortress can also be observed, the very same one besieged by the Crusaders before their ill-fated encounter with Bayezid. The fortress remained in Turkish hands until the beginning of the 19th century. In 1810, during one of the many Russian-Ottoman wars, General Mikhail Kutuzov razed it almost to the ground. The Turks had nothing to compare to the military genius of Kutuzov, who in 2 years would defeat Napoleon Bonaparte. After the Russians' withdrawal, however, the Turks returned and rebuilt the fortifications. The strategic importance of Nikopol was as great as ever. At the end of the 19th century, the great powers planned to redraw the map of Europe. Amidst a tactical all-against-all game, everyone targeted the declining Ottoman state. They demanded immediate reforms, and the Ottomans faked them. In 1876, the Bulgarians rose against their age-old oppressors. The rebellion was brutally suppressed. Tens of thousands were massacred, including children and the elderly. The public response in Europe was overwhelming. A massive wave of indignation swept the continent. Russia took advantage of the situation and in April of 1877 declared yet another war on the Ottoman Empire in coalition with Romania, Montenegro, Serbia, and with the eager participation of Bulgarian volunteers. At the outset of hostilities, a Russian flotilla sailed down the Danube and bombarded any Turkish vessels they came across. The Turks were convinced the main offensive would be against Nikopol or Tutrakan. Russian intelligence scanned the shore and settled for a spot between the two, along the Zimnich-Svistov axis. The Russian forces were divided into an eastern, western, and avant-garde groups. The western group stormed Svistov and immediately made for Nikopol. The latter had to be taken out of action, so as to prevent a counteroffensive against the former. The Turks did not have enough manpower in the vicinity of Nikopol, but a massive army led by Osman Pasha left Vidin and started east in order to reinforce the city. In a matter of months, he was able to become one of the most celebrated commanders of the Ottoman forces. The Russians were led by the generals Nikolai Kredener and Yuri Schulder-Schildener. The Nikopol fortress was commanded by Hasan Pasha, who had at his disposal a 10,000-strong garrison and had orders to hold it at all costs. The Russian army consisted of infantry, cavalry, artillery, and sappers. The entire western group numbered 30,000 men and 108 cannon. They outnumbered the Turks 3-1. Had Osman Pasha made it on time, the advantage would have shifted to the Turks. The city itself had a mostly Turkish population of about 20,000, but it had suffered considerable damage at the hands of the invading force. The Russians had been bombarding it for weeks in order to draw the Ottomans' attention away from Svistov. The defenders had reinforced the fortress with 2 additional lines linked up with the trenches that for a long time remained unnoticed as they were dug in fields and vineyards. The Russians were armed with Krunka rifles of their own making and the American-made Berdana. The Turks sported the far superior British-made Peabody Martini, whereas the Bulgarian volunteers relied on the French Chassepot rifle. Corrupt Turkish statesmen ensured their army had the latest in rifle technology, for a sizable piece of the pie in the shape of a commission, of course. Their greed would eventually bankrupt the empire. Russia's undeniable advantage were its military engineers, a fact made obvious during the Battle of Plevna, a now textbook case at any self-respecting military academy, but also during the Svichtov landing. Hasan Pasha built a defensive line of fortifications west of a village by the name of Musalyevo. He knew the Russians would attack in a western-southwestern direction. General Kredener had divided his soldiers into 3 columns: left, right, and general reserve. The right was to hold the nearby village of Vubal. The left would secure the right bank of the river Osum and cut off the Turkish escape route. Tens of cannon bombarded the fortress from across the Danube. At dawn on the 15th of July, the right column split into 3 groups in order to storm the strong Turkish redoubt at Musalyevo. By 4 in the afternoon, both it and the bridges over the Osum were taken. The left column started towards Vubal. A furious artillery exchange ensued. By 7 o'clock the same evening, that too fell. The Turks retreated to the fortress. Darkness enveloped all. The following day, the 16th of July, was to be fateful. There would be no battle. Osman Pasha realized that he would not be able to make it on time to help the defenders, and instead turned towards the strategically important town of Plevna. The morale of the fortress defenders reached a new low. They gave Hasan Pasha an ultimatum: to surrender or face mutiny. In the morning, a white flag appeared on the battlements. Over 7,000 troops fell captive. Some months later, the Ottomans would suffer another crushing blow, this time in Plevna. The latter marked the beginning of the end of the war. When Ottoman strategists reviewed the war, they came to the conclusion that Nikopol should not have been abandoned, that it should have been turned into another Plevna. Too late. The Russian army fanned out into southern Bulgaria and soon reached the walls of Istanbul. The great powers intervened, and the result was the San Stefano Peace Treaty, which marked the restoration of Bulgarian statehood. Five centuries earlier, the battle for Nikopol between the Crusaders and Bayezid signaled the demise of the southeastern European Christian states and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. In turn, the Second Battle of Nikopol marked the beginning of its end and the rebirth of Balkan Christendom. The little Danubian city is like a bookend of history. A cycle was complete. What looked like the end of Eastern European Christendom in 1396 became its new beginning in 1877. The Second Bulgarian Empire was reborn into the Third Kingdom. The last Bulgarian capital greeted the new one.